Welcome back to Psyche of Power. It is February 25, 1986. A U.S. Air Force helicopter cuts through the humid Manila night. Inside sits Ferdinand Marcos, the absolute ruler of the Philippines for 21 years. He is fleeing his palace. He is fleeing his country. But as he looks down at the millions of people screaming for his blood, his primary emotion isn't fear, it is profound, heartbreaking confusion. According to the diaries of those in the helicopter, Marcos kept asking a single, haunting question to his silent generals. Why are they doing this? I gave them everything. He wasn't acting. He wasn't trying to save face in front of his inner circle. In this final, humiliating hour, Ferdinand Marcos genuinely believed that he was profoundly, unconditionally loved by the Filipino people. History books will tell you that dictators are sociopathic liars who enslave nations through calculated terror. That is a comforting fairy tale. The truth is far more terrifying. The most dangerous tyrants do not cynically fake their messianic complex. Through a vicious biochemical and psychological feedback loop, they actually become their own most devoted believers. Today, we are not just doing a history lesson. We are performing a psychological autopsy on a dead dictator's mind. We are going to dissect the ultimate echo chamber. We will explore how absolute power permanently rewires the human prefrontal cortex, transforming a brilliant, calculating lawyer into a delusional prisoner of his own mythology. Act 1. The Architect of the Mirage. To understand the collapse, you must understand the construction. When Marcos was first elected in 1965, he didn't need to fake the love. He was brilliant, charismatic, and a masterful orator. He had a photographic memory. He represented a golden future. The applause he received was entirely, undeniably real. But the human brain is not designed to process the adoration of millions. Neurologically, immense social approval triggers massive floods of dopamine and serotonin. Over time, a politician's dopamine receptors downregulate. Just to feel normal, they require larger and larger doses of public worship. Applause transforms from a political tool into a biological necessity. By the time he declared martial law in 1972, the organic applause had begun to fade as corruption and poverty rose. A normal leader would accept this negative feedback and adjust policy. But Marcos's brain was already addicted to the mythology of his own greatness. He couldn't handle the biochemical withdrawal of losing his popularity. So, he built a machine to manufacture it. He shut down the free press. He imprisoned his political rivals. He surrounded himself exclusively with sycophants. We call this censorship, but functionally, it was the construction of a sensory deprivation tank. Marcos systematically severed every neurological nerve ending that connected his government to the painful reality of the streets. He replaced organic reality with orchestrated reality. He commissioned epic murals depicting himself as Malakas, the mythical first Filipino man. He built a regime where the only currency for survival was absolute theatrical agreement with the president. But here is the psychological trap. When you force people to lie to you, you eventually forget that they are lying. This brings us to a devastating concept formulated by economist and psychologist Timur Kuran, known as preference falsification. When a regime is intensely oppressive, Citizens hide their true political preferences to survive. They cheer when told to cheer. They vote yes in rigged referendums. They publicly praise the dictator while privately despising him. Preference falsification creates a terrifying data gap. The citizens are faking their love, but the dictator's administration collects this fake data and presents it to the dictator as empirical truth. Look, Mr. President, 98% of the country voted for you. The lie travels up the chain of command, laundering itself into a fact. Marcos was a man obsessed with legalism and data. When his generals handed him these falsified reports of booming economies and zero dissent, his confirmation bias swallowed them whole. He wasn't ignoring the truth. He was genuinely receiving highly curated, scientifically presented garbage. The echo chamber wasn't just acoustic, it was institutionalized. And then there was Imelda. If Marcos was the architect of the echo chamber, his wife Imelda was its chief interior designer. To understand Ferdinand's delusion, you must understand their shared psychological pathology. In clinical terms, they engaged in a massive, state-sponsored version of Folido, Dahox, a shared psychosis transmitted from one individual to another. Imelda notoriously collected thousands of shoes, bought skyscrapers in Manhattan, and wore bulletproof brass made of diamonds. To the outside world, it was grotesque kleptocracy. But inside the echo chamber, Imelda framed her unimaginable excess as a noble sacrifice. She famously claimed that she had to be a star for the poor to look up to. Ferdinand completely bought into this twisted logic. They validated each other's delusions daily. Whenever a sliver of doubt crept into Ferdinand's mind, Imelda was there to reinforce the narrative. We are not stealing from them, Ferdinand. We are curating the nation's glory. We are their mother and father. Children do not understand what parents must do. This is the lethal nature of the authoritarian feedback loop. The dictator eliminates all critics. He promotes only those who praise him. The sycophants, wanting more power, exaggerate their praise. The dictator, receiving only exaggerated praise, believes his own divinity. He then demands even greater worship, starting this cycle all over again. Slowly, the biological structure of Marcos' mind adapted to this golden poison. Empathy requires a connection to the suffering of others. But when your sensory inputs are entirely comprised of flattering statistics and luxurious galas, the neural pathways responsible for empathy simply atrophy. He lost the physical ability to comprehend the pain of a hungry citizen. He lived in Malacaang Palace, a fortress of isolation. He rarely ventured out into the real streets. When he did, the roads were sanitized. The cheering crowds were paid actors or terrified government employees, and the slums were literally hidden behind massive, freshly painted white fences constructed by Imelda overnight. Imagine living your entire adult life in a world where poverty vanishes the moment you look in its direction, where everyone you meet trembles with awe, where every idea you have is immediately declared a stroke of absolute genius by men with PhDs. How long could your grip on reality survive? You wouldn't survive a month. Marcos endured this psychological distortion for 2 decades. The man who once passed the bar exam with near-perfect scores while sitting in a jail cell had completely outsourced his reality, testing to a machine designed to lie to him. the tragedy was set. And here is the first major cognitive reversal of our story. We always assume that dictators brainwash the masses. We assume they use propaganda to mold the minds of the people. But looking through the lens of psychological mechanics, the exact opposite happened in the Philippines. Marcos did not brainwash the Philippines. The Philippines brainwashed Marcos. Through their forced smiles, their mandatory applause, and their desperate preference, falsification, the trapped millions unknowingly built an impenetrable psychological matrix around their oppressor. The sheer volume of fake compliance generated by the population became the propaganda that Marcos himself consumed. He became the ultimate victim of his own state-sponsored lies. He was the puppet master who got so tangled in his own strings that he believed he was flying. Act 2. The Biochemistry of Delusion. By the early 1980s, the illusion was total. Marcos' kidneys were failing. He was ravaged by lupus. He was heavily medicated, further blurring the lines between reality and drug-induced euphoria. But the ideological armor surrounding his ego remained indestructible. Powerful steroids used to treat his illness caused severe mood swings, paranoia, and periods of manic grandiosity. His physiological decay mirrored the decay of his regime, yet his brain compensated by doubling down on the fantasy. He convinced himself that his physical suffering was a Christ-like burden he bore for the Filipino people. He began to speak of himself in the third person. He started writing diaries not as a private reflection, but as historical documents, destined to be read by future civilizations who would worship him. He was completely insulated by what psychologists call the illusion of asymmetric insight. The illusion of asymmetric insight is a cognitive bias where a person believes they understand their peers better than their peers understand themselves. Marcos looked at the growing unrest in the provinces, the murmurs of rebellion, and he smiled. He thought, I know the Filipino heart. They are just confused. They secretly love me. He interpreted every act of resistance not as a rejection of his rule, but as a minor temper tantrum by his deeply beloved but slightly ignorant children. They don't see the big picture, he told his cabinet. He believed his insight into the nation's soul was absolute. It is a terrifying arrogance born of absolute isolation. This bias is lethal. When you believe you understand your enemies better than they understand themselves, you stop listening to their actual demands. You stop reading the room. You play chess against an opponent you believe is a toddler, entirely unaware that the toddler is holding a loaded gun. Then came August 1983. The glitch in the matrix. Benigno Aquino Jr., Marcos' greatest political rival, returns from exile and is immediately assassinated on the tarmac of Manila International Airport. The bullet that shattered Aquino's skull also shattered the soundproof glass of Marcos' echo chamber. Millions poured into the streets for Aquino's funeral. It was the largest demonstration in Philippine history. It was a massive, undeniable rejection of the Marcos regime. The preference falsification had ended. The people took off their smiling masks and screamed their hatred directly at the palace gates. So, how did the dictator's mind process this catastrophic collision with reality? Did he experience a sudden awakening? Did he realize the country hated him? No. The human brain, when faced with ego-destroying information, engages a defensive protocol. Marcos looked at the millions of furious citizens and felt nothing but irritation. This brings us to our second psychological reversal, the Teflon identity shield, formerly known in psychology as Identity-Protective Cognition, formulated by researchers like Dan Kahan. This theory explains how human beings process empirical evidence that threatens their core identity. When presented with facts that destroy who we believe we are, our brains do not change our beliefs. Instead, our brains attack the credibility of the facts. For Marcos to accept that the protesters were genuine meant accepting that he was a tyrant, a failure, and a monster. His ego literally could not survive that calculation. So, Identity-Protective Cognition kicked in. Marcos's brain aggressively reinterpreted the data. Those millions of people aren't angry at me, he rationalized. They are being manipulated by communist agitators. They have been tricked by the CIA. They are paid extras. He constructed bizarre, elaborate conspiracies to explain away the hatred. It is fascinating and horrifying. The more evidence you present to a deep-seated delusion, the stronger the delusion becomes. The protests didn't break his belief that he was loved. They convinced him that his beloved people were under a temporary spell, and that he, the strict father, needed to discipline them for their own good. Driven by this colossal delusion, Marcos made the most fatal miscalculation of his life in late 1985. During an interview on American television, he arrogantly called for a snap presidential election. He wanted to prove to the world and to himself that the vocal minority was just that, a minority. He was absolutely certain he would win easily. But the echo chamber had degraded his political instincts. When the election happened in February 1986, the opposition, led by Aquino's widow Corazon, surged. Marcos's cronies had to engage in massive, clumsy, and highly visible electoral fraud just to keep him afloat. The fraud was so blatant that 30 computer technicians responsible for tallying the votes walked out of the election commission in protest. The military began to fracture. The Catholic Church openly condemned the cheating. The carefully constructed theatrical set of the Marcos regime was burning down on live television. Yet, inside Malaking Palace, Marcos threw himself an inauguration party. He stood on the balcony, declaring himself the legitimate winner. He genuinely believed that if he just projected enough authority, reality would bend back into the shape he desired. He was a wizard waving a wand that had lost all its magic. Act 3. The Collapse of the Reality Distortion Field, February 22, 1986. The military finally turns against him. Millions of Filipinos gather on Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, EDSA. They block the tanks with their bodies. They offer flowers to the soldiers. The regime is paralyzed. Marcos ordered his loyal generals to fire on the crowds. He demanded artillery strikes, but the generals, staring at millions of unarmed civilians, nuns, and children, refused. The chain of command, built on decades of bribery and fear, instantly evaporated in the face of absolute moral clarity. For the first time in 21 years, a command issued by Ferdinand Marcos was simply ignored. The acoustic dampening of the echo chamber was shattered. The cold, brutal wind of reality howled into the palace. He had no power. He had no authority. He only had the delusion. As the palace descended into a frantic panic, with aides frantically stuffing diapers boxes with millions of dollars in fresh $100 bills and diamonds, Marcos sat frozen. The cognitive dissonance was finally too massive for his brain to filter. The system crashed. He wasn't just losing his country. He was losing his identity. The psychological collapse of a narcissist when they are deprived of their narcissistic supply is a terrifying spectacle. He became a ghost haunting his own life. The confident dictator was replaced by a confused, broken old man who couldn't understand why his children were evicting him. Which brings us back to that helicopter ride on the night of February 25. As the aircraft lifted off, taking him to exile in Hawaii, he looked down at the rejoicing millions. Fireworks exploded over Manila. The people were dancing in the streets because he was gone. This brings us to our final and most haunting psychological truth. The tragedy of the echo chamber is not just that it makes you blind to reality. It ensures that when reality finally arrives, you lack the psychological vocabulary to understand it. Marcos, staring at his own overthrow, could not process the concept of hatred. His brain had not utilized that emotional receptor toward himself in decades. Therefore, he literally could not believe his own eyes. He interpreted the nationwide celebration of his downfall as a tragic, monumental misunderstanding. During his years of exile in Hawaii, Marcos never repented. He never showed a fraction of remorse. Friends and journalists who visited him noted something incredibly disturbing. He spent his days waiting by the telephone, expecting the Filipino people to call him and apologize. He genuinely believed that the Philippines would realize their terrible mistake, that they would collapse without his genius, and that they would beg their father to come home. He spent his final 3 years meticulously planning a triumphant return that the rest of the universe knew was mathematically impossible. He did not die a tyrant racked with guilt. He died a martyr in the cathedral of his own mind. The ultimate punishment for Ferdinand Marcos wasn't exile. It was the fact that he was locked inside a psychological prison of his own making, unable to ever touch reality again. We look at figures like Marcos, and we think their greatest crime is what they do to others. But from a psychological standpoint, the ultimate horror of absolute power is what it does to the wielder. It turns the human mind into a self-consuming machine, eating its own sanity to sustain its ego. And before you dismiss this as an old historical anecdote, look around. Look at your social media feeds. Look at modern politicians, CEOs, and influencers who ban every critic, delete every negative comment, and surround themselves with digital sycophants. The echo chamber effect has been democratized. We are all, on some level, building our own little Malacanang palaces. We are all curating our realities, filtering out the data that hurts our egos, and engaging in our own identity-protective cognition. We are all susceptible to the illusion that our curated reflection is our true self. The story of Ferdinand Marcos is a terrifying warning. It is a clinical demonstration that when you wage war against the truth doesn't die. It just goes into hiding, patiently waiting for the structural integrity of your delusion to collapse under its own weight. And when the collapse happens, it is absolute. The echo chamber may protect your feelings for a decade or even two, but reality has a 100% win rate. It always collects its debts, and it charges a catastrophic rate of interest for the years you spent ignoring it. This is Psyche of Power. We don't just tell you what happened. We show you the dark biological mechanics of why it happened. Because if you do not understand the psychology of the tyrant, you are doomed to help build his echo chamber. Next time you find yourself entirely surrounded by people who agree with your every word, don't celebrate, be terrified. Because the moment the applause becomes unanimous, you have officially lost your mind. Power is not simply the ability to command armies or steal billions. Real power, the kind that survives, is the excruciatingly painful ability to tolerate the truth when it tells you that you are fundamentally flawed. Marcos lacked that power. He traded reality for a comfortable lie, and in doing so, he engineered his own total psychological annihilation. He believed he was loved, and that belief was the sharpest guillotine ever designed. He died in 1989, a broken god, waiting for a phone call from a nation that had already moved on. His body was eventually brought back, but his mind had left the real world decades before his heart stopped beating. What is your echo chamber? What preference falsification are you relying on to protect your ego? Who is lying to you right now? Simply because you have made the truth too dangerous to tell. Beware the applause. Beware the unanimous consent. In the grand psychological theater of life, the loudest cheers are often just the sound of your own mind, building a prison around your soul. The Philippines survived the delusion. They tore down the white fences. They embraced the chaos of reality, and they proved that the human spirit cannot be permanently suffocated by a manufactured matrix. Truth is abrasive. It is ugly. It is disrespectful to authority, but it is the only foundation upon which a sane mind and a sane society can actually be built. Everything else is just a fairy tale waiting for a nightmare. Marcos's delusion is documented history, but the psychological software that ran his delusion is pre-installed in every single human brain. The only difference between a dictator and a normal person is the budget they have to fund their defense mechanisms. A throne is a dangerous piece of furniture. It is scientifically designed to elevate you above the dirt, above the crowd, and ultimately above reality itself. The higher you sit, the less oxygen reaches your moral compass. This is the tragic paradox of absolute control. You spend your whole life building walls to protect yourself from your enemies, only to realize that the walls are soundproof and you have locked yourself inside with your own madness. Asymmetric insight, preference, falsification, identity-protective cognition. These are not just academic terms. They are the weapons of mass psychological destruction that tyrants deploy against themselves. They are the silent killers of empires. History is not a record of dates and battles. It is a medical chart of human psychopathology, if we read it correctly. It provides the exact diagnostic criteria needed to spot the next delusional architect before they lay their first brick. We look back at the millions who falsified their preferences And we must ask how much of our own daily compliance is just a survival tactic? How much of our own reality is a carefully negotiated lie to avoid friction with the powerful? The EDSA revolution wasn't just a political uprising. It was a mass psychological breakthrough. It was the moment a nation collectively decided to stop gaslighting themselves to protect one man's fragile, monstrous ego. It takes immense courage to stop clapping. It takes revolutionary bravery to tell the emperor he is naked, especially when the emperor has convinced himself that he is wearing the most magnificent armor ever forged. The diaries of Ferdinand Marcos remain a chilling testament to his descent. Pages upon pages of brilliant legal mind twisting itself into psychotic knots, desperately trying to mathematically prove that he was a god. A genius intellect does not protect you from delusion. It only makes your delusions more complex, more articulate, and vastly more difficult to dismantle. A smart man builds a stronger echo chamber. The silence that Marcos feared wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of reflection. Silence forces you to hear your own conscience. And for a man who had tortured his nation, silence was the ultimate acoustic terror. The withdrawal from power is biologically identical to the withdrawal from hard narcotics, the panic, the sweating, the absolute denial. Marcos didn't just lose an election. He was forced into a cold turkey detox from a 20-year dopamine binge. So, what is the antidote to the echo chamber? It is brutal, unfiltered friction. It is surrounding yourself with people who do not need your money, do not fear your anger, and are perfectly willing to tell you that you are wrong. The truth is a destructive element. It shatters comfort. It ruins beautiful myths. But it is the only element that does not evaporate when history applies pressure. Marcos built his house on the sand of sycophancy. The truth was the tide. Thank you for watching Psyche of Power. If this psychological autopsy fundamentally shifted how you view history, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below with the echo chambers you see in the world today. Until next time, question the applause, and never trust a king who thinks he is a father. Stay paranoid.